When I was 20, my old Honda finally gave up for good, and there was no way I could afford repairs. As a broke student, that meant walking 3 miles to the subway every day for my economics classes. The morning walks were fine, but getting home after long evening seminars was brutal. My route down Oak Street felt endless, and by the time I got off the train and started the trek, my legs were like lead. One October evening, I left campus late. The sky had gone that deep gray that means the rain's coming fast, and by the time I hit the street outside the station, it was pouring. My jacket was thin, more for wind than water, and I hadn't bothered with an umbrella. Within minutes, my jeans were soaked through and water was trickling down the back of my neck. The sidewalks were mostly empty except for a few people hurrying the opposite way under umbrellas. I kept my head down, trying to shield my face from the rain. That's when I heard the hum of an engine pulling up beside me. I glanced left and saw a dark blue sedan keeping pace with me at the curb. It wasn't brand new, but it was clean, well kept. The passenger window slid down with an electric whir, and a man leaned over from the driver's seat. He looked like the kind of guy you'd see leaving an office downtown. Dark business suit, crisp white shirt, tie loosened just enough to look casual, maybe 40 years old. His face was clean-shaven, hair neatly combed, and he had this faint, polite smile. "Need a lift?" he called over the sound of the rain. His tone was easy, friendly. I hesitated only a second before stepping closer to hear him better. The car's interior lights cast a warm glow over beige leather seats. The rain was pounding harder now, bouncing off the hood and roof. I was freezing, water dripping from my hair into my eyes, and the idea of a warm, dry ride the rest of the way home felt like a miracle. "Yeah, thanks," I said, pulling the door open. The cabin smelled faintly of some cologne I couldn't place, mixed with that warm air heater smell. I dropped into the passenger seat, shutting the door against the downpour, and instantly felt the heat coming from the vents. My wet clothes started to steam. We pulled away from the curb smoothly. He asked about school, what I was studying, whether I lived nearby. I told him economics, gave him my street name, and he nodded like he knew the area. We talked about the weather, about how miserable walking in it must be, and he mentioned he had a son about my age. Said he knew how rough college life could be. I settled back against the seat, trying to relax for the first time that day. The wipers beat a steady rhythm against the windshield, and streetlights smeared into long yellow streaks through the wet glass. The ride was quiet in that comfortable way, his hands steady on the wheel, the tires humming on the slick asphalt. For the first 10 minutes, everything felt perfectly normal. Then he started asking questions that felt different from the small talk earlier. "What building do you live in exactly?" he asked, glancing over at me quickly, then back at the road. "You got roommates? Anyone waiting up for you tonight?" I answered without thinking at first, just out of habit. But as I spoke, I realized how personal the questions were. The way he kept sneaking those side looks at me made my shoulders tense. He didn't blink much, and the corners of his mouth twitched into little smiles that didn't match the conversation. When we entered my neighborhood, I sat forward and pointed to the left. "That's my street there, just turn here." He drove right past. "You missed it," I said, a little louder this time. He gave a slow smile, his eyes still on the road ahead. "I know a shortcut. Trust me. It's quicker." My stomach tightened. I knew these streets well enough to be sure there was no shortcut in that direction. I glanced out the window, watching familiar houses give way to long stretches of chain-link fence and empty lots. The streetlights were fewer here, the darkness heavier. I turned in my seat. "Just let me out here. I'll walk." He didn't answer. His hand stayed steady on the wheel. He pulled into a narrow back lane I'd never noticed before, the pavement cracked and broken. At the far end were two dark, boarded-up warehouse buildings. He rolled the car to a stop between them, cut the engine, and set the gear shift into park. "What are we doing here?" I asked, already reaching for the handle. I heard the click of the locks before I could pull it. He turned toward me, leaning his elbow on the console. That smile stretched wider now. "Relax," he said softly. "We're going to have some fun together." My pulse spiked. "Let me out." He reached across, grabbing my wrist, his grip tight and hot. His voice dropped lower, and he started describing things he wanted to do to me, the words deliberate and vile. I yanked against his hold, but he was stronger, his arm locking mine against the seat. "Stop fighting," he snapped, "unless you want me to hurt you." The car felt suddenly smaller, the air heavy. My eyes darted around, desperate for something, anything. That's when I noticed the emergency brake handle, just inches from my thigh. I didn't think, I just grabbed it and yanked with everything I had. The brake popped up and the car jolted forward with a violent clunk. He was thrown forward into the steering wheel, swearing loudly. His grip loosened for the first time. I slammed my free hand onto the lock switch, shoved the door open, and scrambled out into the cold night air. My shoes slipped on the wet pavement, but I kept my balance and sprinted toward the mouth of the alley. "Get back here!" he shouted behind me, but his voice was fading. I didn't look back. I cut between two fences, stumbled onto a better-lit side street, and ran until my lungs burned. By the time I reached a main road, headlights from passing cars washed over me, and I forced myself to slow enough to look around. He hadn't followed. I walked the rest of the way home fast, every sound making me flinch. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door, then locked it again, and sat on the floor until my breathing slowed. The next morning, I went straight to campus security. I gave them the license plate number I'd repeated to myself over and over during the walk home. They wrote everything down and promised to forward it to the police. I never found out if they caught him. I never saw that blue sedan again. But I stopped cutting through side streets at night, stopped taking favors from strangers, no matter how harmless they looked. If it meant walking 10 miles in the pouring rain, so be it. I'd rather arrive home soaked to the bone than ever step into a car with someone I didn't know again. So when I was 15, I spent summer vacation with my uncle in rural Colorado back in 2010. He lived way up in the mountains where the nearest neighbors were miles apart. My 16-year-old cousin Brad and I got pretty bored after a few days of just hanging around the house. One particularly hot afternoon, we decided to explore the paved road that wound through the pine-covered hills behind my uncle's property. We didn't bring much, just a couple of water bottles, our phones, and a pocket knife Brad insisted on carrying. The air smelled like warm sap and dust, and the only sounds were the occasional chirp of birds and the crunch of gravel under our sneakers. We followed the road as it curved uphill, patches of sunlight breaking through the tall pines, and past the rusted remains of an old fence half swallowed by weeds. We had been walking for maybe half an hour when we heard it, branches snapping somewhere in the thick forest off to our right. At first, we figured it was just a deer or elk moving through the trees. We stopped to listen, and the noise paused too, like whatever it was had stopped when we did. Then we heard breathing, slow at first, then heavier. It definitely sounded human. It wasn't the kind of out-of-breath sound you make after a run. It was deep, heavy, like someone trying to control it. Brad glanced at me and raised his eyebrows. We stood still for a few seconds, the sun hot on our backs, just listening. The breathing shifted, closer now, mixed with the faint scrape of a shoe or boot on dirt. I tried to look between the trees, but the undergrowth was thick and shadowed. The sound of a stick snapping made me take a step back onto the road. We didn't say anything, just waited, staring into the green wall of forest. That's when a man crashed out of the woods about 50 yards ahead of us. His plaid shirt was torn at one sleeve and streaked with dirt, his jeans muddy, and there were fresh scratches across his face and forearms like he'd run through brambles. His hair was damp and messy, and he looked completely panicked. Eyes darting, mouth partly open like he'd just finished running hard. When he spotted us standing there, he froze mid-step, like a deer caught in headlights. His chest rose and fell quickly, and I noticed one of his hands was clenched tight, knuckles pale. The road was so quiet then that I could hear the faint rattle of his breathing. Nobody moved or spoke for a few seconds. He just stared at us, almost like he was trying to decide something. Brad shifted slightly, and the man's eyes flicked toward him for a split second before snapping back to me. Then, without saying a word, he spun on his heel and bolted off the road, disappearing into the trees on the opposite side. His footsteps crashed through the underbrush for several seconds before fading. Brad and I stayed rooted where we were, staring at the spot where he'd vanished. The air still and silent again except for the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. We probably should have headed straight home, but curiosity got the better of us. We decided to check out where the guy had come from originally. Following the broken branches and the scuffed dirt, we left the road and stepped into the pines. The ground was soft with needles and pockets of granite. We moved slow so we didn't snap twigs. We stopped often to listen. No voices, no engines, just flies and the faint trickle of water somewhere below the slope. We followed the disturbance like a breadcrumb trail. Ferns were bent. A sapling was split at the top where something heavy had dragged through. On a patch of dark soil, I saw the outline of a sneaker. The toe dug deep like the person had lunged downhill. Brad didn't talk. He just pointed and kept going, using his forearm to push branches aside. The heat sat under the trees like a blanket that didn't move. After about 10 minutes, our slope dropped into a shallow ravine. A creek wound along the bottom over stones the color of old coins. That was where we saw the second man. He was big and stocky, and he was kneeling by the water on one knee. His jacket was torn at the elbow. His head was bowed. In his hands was a folding camping knife that he was washing in the stream. He turned the blade under the flow, slow and steady, like he was rolling a spoon under a tap. Sunlight flashed along the edge each time he rolled it. We both froze. Then, moving together, we slipped behind a set of boulders on our side of the ravine. We kept low and watched through a gap. The man never looked around. He just kept cleaning. He folded the knife halfway and used his thumb to press along the joint, then opened it again and let the water run. He rubbed the spine with the heel of his hand, dipped, rubbed again, dipped again. It was careful, repetitive, not casual, not quick. The water swirled where it hit the metal. I noticed his hands were scraped across the knuckles. One cuff had a faint pink wash at the edge, like it had been rinsed but not fully. He didn't drink or splash his face. He didn't look tired. He looked focused on a single task. Brad's grip tightened on my sleeve. He tilted his head back toward the way we came. I understood. We had seen enough. We eased back one heel at a time. We kept our weight over our feet so we wouldn't slide rocks. The smell of wet stone and metal sat there. At the bank, we belly crawled up into a thicket and stayed there a few seconds to listen. Nothing moved except the water. A breeze lifted the tops of the trees and died. We stood and stepped off along our own tracks. The return felt longer. I kept seeing the first guy's face in my head, the way he froze at the road, and then the second man's hands pinching the hinge of that knife. We lost the trail once where the brush grew even, and the ground was all the same color. Brad glanced up through the branches to find the sun and corrected us a few yards. Neither of us spoke. When we reached the pavement, it was like hitting bright water. Heat lifted off the blacktop. We just turned and headed for the house at a fast walk that almost became a run. Every bend in the road felt like a place someone could step out. I kept checking behind us. Back there was only shimmer and trees. Our footsteps sounded loud on the shoulder. At the property line, we cut across the field to save time, passing the stack of split wood and the old tractor with the flat tire. The windows were open. My uncle was in the kitchen wiping down the counter with a towel. We told him what we saw in order. The crash in the trees. The first man on the road, the second man at the creek washing a folding knife, over and over. He listened. He looked at our torn shirts and the sap. He didn't seem alarmed. He asked if either man spoke. We said no. He asked if we had seen any blood on the road. We hadn't. He stood there with the towel in his hands. Then he said it could be hunters who had a bad shot and were cleaning up to keep bears away. Or campers who cut themselves and got spooked. He told us to drink water and to stay around the house for the rest of the day. After a minute, he added that he would call the Forest Service in the morning just to report it. He made that call after breakfast. A ranger came by late morning in a dusty SUV. She had a brimmed hat and a notebook and a calm voice that made me feel less jumpy. She asked us to tell it from the start. We did. She didn't rush us and didn't push when we couldn't remember tiny details. Then she asked us to point out the spot, and my uncle followed in his truck. The road looked the same as the day before. In the forest, our path had already softened. Branches we bent had fallen back. The footprint was gone. Needles hid our tracks. We found the ravine by sound and slope. The creek ran a little higher. The rocks where we had crouched were warm. The ranger moved slow along both banks, looking at torn fern tips and scuffs in the dirt, but there wasn't much to see. She took a few notes and marked a point on a folded map. Back at the house, she gave my uncle a card. She said sometimes people do strange things in the woods, and it turns out to be nothing serious, and sometimes it doesn't, and they try to check either way. She told us to avoid that side for a few days, and to call if we remembered anything else. Then she left. The screen door clicked, and the house went quiet again. Nothing else ever came of it that we heard. No patrols on the road. No helicopter. No missing posters at the gas pump in town. We asked my uncle twice the next week if anyone called him back. He said no both times. We kept to the property, stacked wood, and rode the old four-wheeler along the fence line. When August ended, I went home to school. Brad and I brought it up sometimes on the phone during the fall, like we were checking the details. 15 years have gone by, and I still think about how the knife flashed in that thin light. I think about the first guy's breathing and how he stopped, then ran. I can build explanations when I try. A messy field dress. A cut hand. 2 guys who argued and then split up. Any of that could be true. But the careful rinsing stayed with me, and the pink at the cuff, and how empty the woods sounded while he worked. We never found out who they were or what they were really doing out there. The only thing I know for sure is what we saw, and that it was real, and that we turned around and left without saying a word, and kept walking until we were back on the road. We kept our pace to the house, I used to work the overnight shift at a 24-hour laundromat in the suburbs when I was 28. It wasn't glamorous work, but I liked nights because there were fewer customers, and I could read or listen to podcasts. The place was in a strip mall on Maple Street, right next to an abandoned car wash. The lights there had been out for years, and the fenced-off bays were choked with weeds. On weeknights, it was usually just me and the low hum of the washers and dryers, the place smelling faintly of detergent and warm lint. It was around midnight on a Wednesday when I noticed the automatic front door opening for no reason. I was at the counter restocking dryer sheets when I heard the glass panels slide apart with that soft electric hum. Nobody walked in. I looked over, thinking maybe a late-night customer was coming, but the doorway was empty. The door stayed open for maybe 30 seconds before closing again. I figured the motion sensor was acting up. Sometimes a moth or piece of dust would trigger it. I thought maybe a stray cat had wandered close, but I didn't see any movement outside. A little later, it happened again. The same slow slide, the same pause, the same smooth close. This went on every 20 or 30 minutes. I kept glancing up from my book whenever I heard it, but there was never anyone there. By the second hour, I was paying more attention. The strip mall was mostly dark except for the glow from my windows and a flickering security light over the shuttered nail salon 2 doors down. Past that, the parking lot stretched into shadow. The only sound was the rumble and churn of machines behind me. I went outside a few times to check. The air was cool, and the lot was empty in every direction. No cars, no people, no animals. The car wash sat silent, its metal fencing catching the dull orange light from the street lamps. There wasn't much wind, and nothing moved except my own shadow stretching under the lights. Each time I stepped back inside, the door slid shut behind me like nothing had happened. I assumed the sensor wiring was loose. I made a mental note to tell my manager in the morning. Around 3 a.m., I was at the counter counting the register for the day shift. The coins clinked quietly on the counter, and I could feel the faint vibration of the nearest dryer through the floor. The washers along the far wall churned steadily, the drum doors flashing in their slow spin. That's when the uneasiness crept in. I couldn't pin down why. The air inside felt still in a way it hadn't earlier, and every small sound, the click of the bill counter, the swish of the drum, the faint drip from the utility sink, seemed sharper, like they were happening in a larger, emptier space than the one I was standing in. The front door was in my peripheral vision as I stacked the bills into the drawer. I kept catching myself glancing at it, listening for that smooth, sliding sound. The rest of the laundromat was lit but empty, the rows of machines stretching away in both directions, silver doors gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The counter felt too far from the door, and the open space between them suddenly seemed like something I didn't want to cross. I kept my head down, counting slower, just to stay occupied, but my ears were tuned to every shift in sound from the machines, every tiny creak of the building. I heard the footsteps first, quick and careful, like someone trying to be quiet and failing. They came from behind the triple-load dryers. I turned and stopped breathing. A skinny man in a dark hoodie stood about 10 feet away with the hood up. His face looked unshaven and gray. His eyes were red like he hadn't slept. In his right hand he held a folding knife, the blade out, maybe 4 inches, bright under the fluorescent lights. I kept my voice low and steady and asked if he needed help. He didn't answer. He just stared with a blank look that didn't match the situation. I told him I could give him the cash from the drawer. I said it plain. He blinked, slow and empty. He didn't glance at the money. He didn't look at the door. The quiet felt heavier than the machine noise. I understood he wasn't there to rob me. He had some other plan I didn't want to see. My hands shook as I inched one hand toward my pocket to feel my phone. He took a step when I moved. The knife came up by an inch, not fast, but sure. I stopped. I could see dried mud on his laces and a nick near the tip of the blade. I shifted my weight so the counter stayed between us. He watched my wrists, not my face. I opened the till with 2 fingers, pulled out a stack of bills and pushed it to the counter's edge. "Take it," I said. Nothing. No nod. No sound from him at all. Up close, he smelled sour and chemical. A wet cough from a washer filled the space where words should have been. I reached again toward my pocket. He moved again, closer, light on his feet. I could feel time running out. The nearest thing with wheels was the wire laundry cart by the folding table. It was half full of lost socks. I grabbed the cart and shoved it as hard as I could in his direction. The wheels screamed over the tile. The cart jumped the floor seam and smashed into the plastic chairs. One chair flipped and slapped the window. Bottles rattled on the shelf. His eyes cut to the noise for a half second. I ran. I cut past the change machine and through the staff gate. The gate banged off my hip and swung back on its spring. He came after me, shoes hitting the tile in fast, flat slaps. I hit the back hallway at a full sprint, shoulders scraping the cinder block, and slammed both hands into the crash bar. The metal door blew open, and I stumbled into the service alley behind the strip mall. Cold air and a wet concrete smell hit me. I sprinted left toward the neighboring store's loading dock. A red sensor lit, and their external alarm exploded into the night. A steady horn that echoed off the abandoned car wash. The sound must have spooked him. His footsteps faded behind the door. I kept running until I reached the big blue dumpster, then dropped behind it and pulled my phone. My thumb shook on the screen. I called 911 and gave the address and said there was a man inside with a knife. I stayed behind the dumpster, eyes on the alley corner, phone to my ear. The alarm kept blaring. A semi rolled past on Maple and the sound folded into the horn. The dispatcher asked if I was safe. I said I was outside, crouched behind the dumpster, door behind me. Every few seconds I peeked around the metal and expected to see the hood and the knife. Nothing moved but trash in the breeze. A patrol car rolled in with lights flashing but no siren. It took 8 minutes. It felt like an hour. I stood up with both hands out so the officers could see I wasn't the problem. We cleared the alley together and went back through the door. The cart lay against the chairs. Coins were scattered under the counter like spilled marbles. The entrance door was shut. The guy was gone. We checked everywhere. The bathroom. The storage closet with the belts and lint screens. Nobody. The machines kept doing their cycles like nothing had happened. A washer timer clicked down the last seconds. The drain pump buzzed, and then it cut off. It sounded normal, which made it worse. My manager arrived with a ring of keys and a jacket over pajamas. We pulled up the cameras on the little monitor under the counter. The picture was grainy and gray, the timestamp a white block in the corner. We rewound to midnight. We watched me read. Me walk to the door. The door opened by itself. Me walk out and stare at an empty lot. We let it run fast, and then slowed it when something twitched near the far wall. At 12:11 a.m., a shoe sole flashed under the vent base of the industrial dryers. If you didn't look for it, you missed it. The metal panel flexed a hair like someone leaned against it from the gap behind the machines. He had parked himself back there, in the hot space with the vent hoses, and waited. At 12:32, the front door slid open and closed with no one near it. On camera, a small object flicked toward the sensor line from the far aisle and then vanished. He used it to trip the door again and again as a distraction. He stayed hidden for over 3 hours. At 3:04 a.m., he slipped out from behind the dryers like he'd climbed out of a wall. Thin, sideways, hood low, hand in his pocket. He hugged the metal and kept the camera at his back. He watched me count the drawer. When the loading dock alarm went off later, he slid back the same way and then cut across a blind spot toward a side exit 2 units down. On the exterior camera, he was a blur under a dead lamp, hood up and head down. We switched to the camera facing the bathroom and saw what he did after I ran. He yanked the register tray and slammed it on the counter until the coins sprayed and the plastic cracked. He spray painted across the wall in big slanted letters, black on white. The words were short and ugly, the kind you scrub and still see. The paint haze still hung in the air when we walked past it. The officers took statements. They bagged the paint can he'd left by the trash. They dusted the counter edges, though he'd likely worn gloves. On the monitor, the knife showed only once, a quick triangle of light when he stepped into the aisle behind me. Then the frame showed me shoving the cart and sprinting. One officer asked if I recognized him. I didn't. He asked if anyone had been hanging around earlier. I said the usual late-night people, nobody like that. We shut the place down. My manager taped a paper sign on the glass that said, "Closed for maintenance." The tape peeled at the corners, and he pressed it with his thumb. We turned off what we could and let the last dryers spin down. The room got quieter in layers. I swept the spilled coins into a dustpan and poured them into a bag we used for quarters. I didn't like the way my hands shook. I went home when the day shift came in. I slept a couple hours and woke up to the sound of the front door in my head, that soft slide and the pause before it shut. I went back that afternoon to meet the owner and replay the footage again. We stood where I had stood and looked down the long aisles. The paint on the wall was half scrubbed, a dark rectangle where the threat had been. The solvent smell sat low, mixed with hot lint. The official report said unknown suspect, no further leads, patrol increased in the area. They left a card and told me to call if he came back. I started carrying a small flashlight in my pocket even in the daytime, out of habit. Every noise sounded like a footstep for a while. The next week, I quit. I told them I couldn't do overnights alone anymore. They offered me weekends with a second attendant, then afternoons at another location. I said no. I cleaned out the little drawer where I kept earplugs and dryer sheets. I dropped my key on the counter and took one last look at the rows of machines, the steel doors catching the ceiling lights, the scuffed tile by the entrance, the empty chairs by the window. I watched the street on Maple for a few seconds, then walked out and never worked alone again. In June 2018, I was 29 and working as a freelance photographer, always looking for places most people ignored. That's how I came across an old reference to a weather station buried deep in a Colorado national forest. The hiking forums I found it on made it sound half forgotten. Rangers apparently discouraged anyone from staying overnight, saying the structure was unsafe, but there were no official closures listed. Sunrise photos from the upper deck sounded worth the risk. I loaded my gear into my Jeep, parked at the end of a Forest Service road, and started hiking. It took me 6 hours to reach it, moving through heavy cedar and pine that closed in on both sides. The trail was faint enough that I was checking my GPS more than my surroundings. Occasionally, I'd catch gaps between the trees that showed nothing but miles of forest. I didn't see a single person the entire way in. By the time I caught my first glimpse of the building's roofline through the branches, my legs ached from the constant uphill and sidestepping loose rock. Up close, the place was in much better shape than the warnings had made it sound. The roof looked solid, and the wooden siding was weathered but intact. Both stories' windows were still in place, some streaked with old rain marks, but not broken. The stairs to the second level didn't creak under my weight, and the observation deck railing still felt secure when I leaned against it. I picked a room on the upper floor with wide, wraparound windows facing the forest to set my sleeping bag. From there, I had an uninterrupted view of green in every direction, no roads or rooftops anywhere. After unpacking, I lit my portable stove in the corner and cooked a quick dinner, then carried my camera onto the deck to catch the sunset. The clouds were clear at first, giving me a deep orange over the trees. But within an hour, a wall of dark gray had pushed in, swallowing the color until everything was shadow. By the time I went back inside, it was pitch black outside. The air inside the station was still, the kind of quiet where you hear your own breathing. I had just zipped my sleeping bag and was arranging my camera batteries when something caught my eye beyond the windows. Down in the trees, far below the slope the building stood on, a faint light moved between the trunks. It wasn't steady like a flashlight beam. It swayed, disappeared behind one tree, then showed again between others, too deliberate to be random. I watched it for several seconds before it slipped out of view, my hand frozen halfway to my pack. The light bobbed and weaved through the forest for a few minutes before disappearing entirely. I stood there, leaning toward the glass, scanning for any sign of it again. The beam never returned. I told myself it was probably another hiker with a headlamp cutting through the woods on some shortcut, though it didn't make much sense why they'd be that far off any marked trail at this hour. I finally unzipped my sleeping bag and lay down, but every few minutes my mind dragged me back to that light, wondering where it went. Sometime after midnight, the sound hit me like a bucket of cold water, deliberate, steady footsteps on the wooden floor beneath me. They weren't random groans of old boards or a branch hitting the wall. Each creak was evenly spaced, slow, and heavy enough that I could almost feel it through the floor. My heart was pounding before I even sat up. I slid out of the bag, careful not to make noise, and grabbed my flashlight from my pack. The switch clicked far too loudly in the silence, and a beam cut across the room, shaking a little in my grip. I moved toward the stairwell, every step making a faint scuff on the wood. The stairs gave a low groan as I descended, and the steps below me stopped instantly, like whoever it was had heard me. The air downstairs felt cooler, still carrying that faint scent of old wood and dust. I scanned the main room, empty. I went methodically through every section of the lower level. Storage closet, empty. Side room, empty. Even the small bathroom was untouched. The front door was still locked from the inside. I checked the latches on the windows. All of them were secure. It made no sense. When I was certain there was nothing, I climbed back up, my own breathing sounding too loud. My eyes were drawn to the far windows as soon as I stepped inside the room. Out there, beyond the slope, just at the edge where the forest started, was a figure. Dark, upright, and still. I couldn't see details. No face, no clothing. But I could feel the weight of their gaze on the building. They didn't move. I stood there for what felt like a long time. The flashlight beam aimed loosely at the floor so I wouldn't give away my position more than I already had. Then, without turning, without any visible motion, the figure seemed to fade backward into the black between the trees, until there was nothing. I sat against the far wall for the rest of the night, the flashlight in my lap and my camera bag within reach. Every faint groan of the old station kept me alert. I didn't remember sleeping at all, though at some point, I must have drifted in and out. When the first light of dawn touched the tops of the trees, I stuffed my gear back into my pack. My hands moved quickly, almost automatically. I wanted to be on the trail before the sun cleared the horizon. Before leaving, I circled the station to make sure nothing had been disturbed outside. That's when I noticed the prints. Fresh boot treads pressed into the dirt near the front porch, deep enough to be recent. They were larger than mine and led away toward the tree line. Next to them, 3 cigarette butts lay half buried in the soil. The paper was still white, no signs of rain or heavy weather damage. Whoever had been here hadn't left long before me. The forest felt closer now, thicker, even in daylight. I adjusted my pack straps and started toward the trail. The weather was clear, no wind, No animal sounds except the occasional distant bird. My boots scuffed against loose rock, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. The hike back should have taken a little over 4 hours, but each turn in the trail seemed to stretch longer. My eyes kept flicking to the gaps between trees, half expecting to see the same still figure shadowing me at a distance. Each time I stopped and looked back, the path was empty, the silence pressing in. By the time the Jeep came into view through the thinning trees, my legs felt lead-heavy. I didn't stop until I was inside with the doors locked, my pack tossed into the passenger seat. I sat there for a moment, the steering wheel under my hands, staring at the narrow dirt road ahead. I didn't take out my camera. I didn't look through the shots I'd taken of the sunset. I just started the engine and drove until the forest was behind me. I never went back to that weather station. After that trip, I started picking locations with more care. Places closer to other hikers. Places I could leave quickly if I needed to. The forest still pulls at me. But I think about that night whenever I'm alone out there. Somewhere between the cedar trunks and the shadows, someone had been watching. And for reasons I still don't understand, they let me leave. When I was 18, I worked evenings at a gas station out on the edge of town, where most of our customers were truckers, travelers, or locals who didn't mind the drive for cheaper gas. It wasn't busy enough to be stressful, but there was always a steady trickle of people coming in for snacks, cigarettes, or coffee. One night, about halfway through my shift, this middle-aged guy came in wearing dirty overalls. He bought an energy drink, and while I rang him up, he started asking about my school, if I was graduating soon, and what my plans were for after. It felt a little too personal, but I answered because I didn't want to be rude or cause a scene. He mentioned that he drove trucks, passed through here often, and liked to chat with people on his route. He wasn't outright creepy, so I didn't think much about it. He paid in cash, told me to stay out of trouble, and walked out. The next week, he showed up again during my shift. This time he grabbed a pack of gum and, without much prompting, picked up right where our previous conversation had left off. He remembered the school I went to, that I'd said I was thinking about community college, even the part about me helping my uncle on weekends. I hadn't given him my name, but it was clear he'd remembered every detail I'd let slip before. That stuck with me a bit more than the first encounter. After that, he started coming in a lot. Sometimes he'd buy a coffee or a snack. Other times he'd just stand near the counter pretending to browse, making small talk whenever the place was empty. A couple of times, I noticed him out in the parking lot long after he'd paid, leaning on his truck and watching the road. He began asking about my work schedule, saying things like, "What days are you here late?" Or, "What time do you usually get off?" Once, when my car was in the shop, and I mentioned it in passing to a coworker, he offered to give me a ride home. I politely declined, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. Not long after I made a social media account, he somehow found it. I'd only had it for a few days, and my settings were public at the time. He started leaving comments under my photos, nothing threatening, but personal enough to make my stomach turn. Stuff like, "That's my favorite color on you," or, "Bet that's the park you told me about." They were little things I knew I'd mentioned in conversation at work, now showing up for anyone to see. I made my profile private that night. My manager must have noticed I was jumpier than usual, especially when certain customers walked in. He asked me if something was wrong, but I brushed it off. I didn't want to make a big deal out of a regular who hadn't technically done anything you could call a crime. Still, I found myself checking the lot more often before stepping outside, and keeping my phone closer than usual whenever the bell above the door rang. It got worse after that. I'd be walking to my evening class and see the same dark blue truck idling on the far side of the lot. Sometimes the headlights would flick on for a second when I passed, then shut off again. I told myself he might just be taking a rest like truckers do, but the sight of that cracked windshield and the faded company logo on the door left no doubt. One night after class, I spotted it parked near the bus stop. I kept my head down and pretended to scroll my phone until the bus came, but when it pulled away, I saw him through the window, standing by the shelter, just watching. A few days later, I went to pick up groceries after school. The parking lot was busy, carts rattling and car doors slamming, and for a moment, I forgot to be on edge. But as I approached the entrance, he stepped out from where he'd been leaning against the wall, grinning like it was a surprise reunion. "Hey, fancy seeing you here," he said, acting like we'd run into each other by accident. My throat went dry. I mumbled something about being in a hurry and walked straight inside, not looking back. Still, I could feel his eyes on me from outside, like heat through glass. That night, it hit me that this wasn't coincidence anymore. He knew where I was going and when. The way he kept turning up couldn't happen without planning. The thought of him memorizing my schedule made my stomach twist. The next day at work, I asked my manager if we could talk privately. I told him everything. Seeing the truck near my classes, the grocery store, the bus stop. He listened, nodded, and said he'd noticed how the guy lingered around the station even when he wasn't buying anything. That evening, when the trucker walked in, my manager met him at the door. I could hear the conversation from behind the counter, my manager's calm but firm voice telling him he wasn't welcome anymore, and if he came back, the police would be called. The man's tone rose, but he didn't shout. He asked why more than once, but my manager didn't budge. After a tense pause, he stepped back outside. Before climbing into his truck, he turned toward the window and locked eyes with me, his mouth set in a thin, flat line. Then he drove off. I thought maybe that would be it. I wanted to believe he'd just move on to another place, another conversation partner. But 3 days later, as I stood at the bus stop after class, he appeared from behind the shelter, moving quickly toward me. My pulse spiked. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "Why'd you get me banned?" His hands were loose at his sides, but his stance blocked the open space. I stepped back toward the curb, gripping my phone in my pocket. "I want you to leave me alone," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "My brother's a police officer. He knows what's going on." The lie slid out without hesitation, and I held his gaze so he couldn't see I was bluffing. Something shifted in his face. His eyes narrowed, then darted away. Without another word, he stepped back, turned, and walked down the block until he disappeared behind a line of parked cars. I stayed frozen until the bus came, scanning the street the whole ride home. I never saw him again after that. No truck at the college lot, no shadow at the bus stop, no sudden appearances in public. But the relief never felt complete. Even now, years later, the hiss of air brakes or the rumble of a diesel engine makes my stomach knot. I learned that some people take politeness as permission, and that sometimes the safest thing you can do is shut the door hard, no matter how it looks. It was early October, still warm enough that I had the windows cracked open while I worked upstairs. The townhouse next to mine had been vacant for 4 months, and I barely noticed it anymore. That night, I was trying to wrap up a batch of freelance work before a deadline. The only sound in my unit, the quiet tapping of my keyboard. Sometime after 9, I caught the first noise. Heavy steps, the muffled thump of soles crossing wood. I stopped typing and listened. The walls between our units were thin enough that you could hear a television next door if someone turned it up. But for months, it had been silent. Now there were footsteps, slow and deliberate, then a creak like weight shifting on an old board. I thought maybe maintenance was finally checking the place over or showing it to renters. After a while, the sounds came again. Movement, then what sounded like a door shutting harder than it needed to. Then nothing for 20 minutes. I went back to work, but the quiet was broken twice more by those same patterns. Slow movement, something shifting weight, another sharp close of a door. It went on like that for hours. Long stretches of nothing followed by noises that didn't fit with the idea of someone just walking a prospective tenant through. By 10:30, I was curious enough to go downstairs. From my front steps, I could see the shared parking strip. No maintenance van, no realtor's car, just my sedan and the neighbor's empty driveway. The night was still, the row of street lamps humming quietly, and I didn't see a single light on inside the vacant unit. I went back in, locked up, and told myself they must have been in and out earlier, and I'd missed the vehicle. I tried to finish the last few pages I needed to get done, already planning to shut down for the night. Near midnight, I was stretching in my chair when I heard something I knew wasn't coming from next door. It was downstairs, in my own place. A low, tuneless humming, faint but steady. It rose and fell like someone murmuring to themselves while doing a chore. I froze, straining to make sure it wasn't coming from outside through the cracked windows. No, it was too enclosed, too close. I'd locked the doors when I'd come back in. My phone was beside the keyboard. I took it, thumbed the screen on, and started toward the stairs, slow enough that the steps didn't creak. The humming didn't stop. It was unhurried, casual, like whoever it was had all the time in the world. I kept to the side of the staircase where it was quieter, moving one step at a time, my phone ready in my hand. By the time I was halfway down, I could see the sliver of my living room through the banister. The light from the street lamp outside cast a dull glow through the blinds, enough to make out shapes in the room. I stopped just above the last step, my eyes fixed on the space beyond the couch, listening to that quiet, steady sound coming from somewhere in the room. There was a man sitting in my favorite armchair with his back to me, shoulders squared and posture relaxed, still humming that same slow, lazy tune. His head was slightly tilted toward the television, which was turned off. In the dim reflection on the dark screen, I could see the faint outline of his face, his eyes fixed forward like he was watching something only he could see. His right arm rested along the chair's armrest, and in his hand, glinting faintly in the low light, was one of my kitchen knives. He wasn't gripping it like he was about to use it, just holding it loosely, the blade angled toward the floor. He didn't shift, didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge that I was there. The humming carried on without a single break. I was certain he knew I was behind him. The stairs creak if you even breathe on them wrong. But he stayed perfectly still, like he was letting me decide what would happen next. I stood frozen for what felt like minutes, my hand tightening around my phone. My mind kept running through possibilities. What he might do if I spoke, if I moved, if I tried to get past him. Every sound in the room seemed magnified. The hum, my breathing, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears. He didn't look big, but the knife made that irrelevant. I stayed still long enough to realize he wasn't going to make the first move. That scared me more than if he had. It clicked suddenly that this was intentional. He was doing this on purpose, trying to drag it out, to make the situation heavier with every second. He wanted me to react before he did, and my gut told me that was the last thing I should do. Without saying a word, I shifted my weight back to the next step, careful not to let it creak. Then another step, and another. I kept my eyes on the back of his head until the railing blocked my view. I moved as slow and quiet as I could, feeling every hair on my arms stand on end. When I reached the top of the stairs, I kept my body low and stepped around toward the front door, my bare feet barely touching the floor. The humming never stopped, the exact same rhythm, the exact same tone, like it was on a loop in his head. My hand found the deadbolt, turned it silently, and eased the door open. The air outside was cooler than I expected, sharp against my face. I stepped out, closed the door until the latch barely touched, and moved down the walkway without looking back. I dialed 911 the second I was far enough that my voice wouldn't carry. I gave the dispatcher my address and whispered as much detail as I could manage. Man in my house, armed with a knife, unknown intentions, entered without permission. She told me to stay on the line and wait somewhere safe. I moved across the parking lot to the farthest street lamp and stayed in the glow, scanning the front windows of my place. The humming carried faintly through the open upstairs window, steady and strange, like he had all the time in the world. It felt longer than it probably was before the first cruiser rolled in. 2 officers got out, one heading straight for my front door while the other stayed near the car, eyes on the building. I watched them disappear inside, their flashlights flickering briefly through the curtains. I waited for shouts, for movement, for anything. But the next thing I saw was them walking him out between them. His hands were cuffed in front, the knife gone, his posture relaxed like they'd just interrupted him mid-nap. He was smiling, broad and unnatural, scanning the lot until his eyes passed over me without stopping. The officers told me they found him exactly where I'd said he would be, still sitting in the chair, still humming, still holding my kitchen knife. He hadn't fought them, hadn't said a word, just smiled like it was all some private joke. They asked if I recognized him. I didn't. I'd never seen him before in my life. When they questioned him in the car, he wouldn't give them a reason for being there, wouldn't explain how he'd gotten inside, wouldn't even give his name. Eventually, they figured out he'd entered through the empty townhouse next door, then climbed across to my balcony. I'd left the sliding door unlocked, and he'd just walked in. They told me it was probably a burglary that had taken a weird turn, but they didn't sound sure. One of them said quietly that his behavior didn't match most break-ins. Too calm, too deliberate. They took him away, but told me I couldn't stay in the house until they finished processing it. I spent 3 nights at a hotel, thinking through every step of that night, hearing the hum in my head over and over. When they finally let me back in, I had new locks on every door and window. I walked through the place, checking each room, each closet, every corner, as if he might somehow still be there. The armchair was back where it belonged, the cushions slightly misshapen from the way he'd been sitting. I stood in front of it for a while, staring at the spot where he'd been, the black glass of the television reflecting my face the same way it had reflected his. I don't use that chair much anymore. Sometimes I'll catch myself avoiding it without thinking, sitting at the far end of the couch instead. If I do sit there, it's never for long before I find a reason to get up. The house feels different now. Same walls, same furniture, but the space has been changed in a way I can't undo. I keep the balcony door locked at all times, even in summer, and I check the locks twice before going to bed. Months have passed, but every so often, usually late at night when the house is still, I'll think I hear it again. That low, steady humming, just loud enough to make my chest tighten. It's never there when I really listen, but it's enough to keep me awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what would have happened if I'd taken one more step toward that chair instead of away. It happened last year when I was 19 and working evenings as a delivery driver for a sushi restaurant. That Thursday, I got an order for a house in Maplewood, one of the expensive neighborhoods where people usually tipped well. The address was 47 Oak Street, and when I pulled up, I saw this huge mansion with a tall fence and thick bushes all around the property. The front gate was slightly open, which seemed strange because people in neighborhoods like this usually keep everything locked tight. I parked on the street and walked up the long driveway with the food bag, checking the address twice to make sure I had the right place. The driveway was long enough that my shoes crunched over small gravel for almost a full minute before I got close to the front porch. There were no cars parked outside that I could see, and most of the curtains on the ground floor windows were drawn tight. The only sound came from a few crows in the trees near the back of the property. The house itself looked spotless from the outside. Fresh paint, trimmed hedges, yet there was something off about how quiet it felt. Usually, in houses this size, you'd hear faint music, a TV, or voices if someone was home. Here, nothing. When I reached the porch, I noticed the welcome mat had a thin layer of leaves and dust on it, like no one had stepped there in days. I shifted the food bag to my other hand and was about to knock when I heard a man's voice through the door, telling me to leave the order in the foyer because he was washing his hands. His voice was calm, maybe mid-40s, polite enough that it didn't raise any alarms. I tried the handle, expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily. The door opened without any resistance, and I stepped inside. Immediately the air felt different. Heavy, warm, and stale. The kind of smell you get when a place hasn't been aired out in a while. The foyer was dim despite the daylight outside. Thick curtains on the windows blocked most of it, and a single lamp on a side table gave off a weak yellow glow. The walls were lined with framed paintings of landscapes, but each one had a film of dust along the edges of the glass. The floor tiles had faint marks from old shoe scuffs, but nothing recent. To the right, an archway led into a sitting room where the furniture looked expensive but hadn't been touched in months. A thin layer of dust covered the coffee table, and one of the armchairs had an indent in the cushion, like something heavy had been sitting there for a long time. I set the food bag on the small table near the door, next to a brass bowl that was empty except for a single dried-out lemon. The faint hum of a refrigerator came from somewhere deeper in the house, but I couldn't hear any running water like I expected if the man was washing his hands. "Food's here," I called out, raising my voice just enough to carry into the hallway. The sound seemed to fall flat in the still air, like the house was swallowing it. I waited a few seconds, listening for footsteps or any sign of movement. Nothing. The quiet was so complete that I could hear my own breathing. I adjusted the strap of my delivery bag on my shoulder, my eyes drifting toward the dark hallway ahead. The same voice came from somewhere deeper in the house, asking me to bring the order to the kitchen because he couldn't come to the front door right now. It still sounded like the same man, but there was something different this time. Too insistent, the words drawn out in a way that felt unnatural. He spoke with this overly polite tone, like he was trying hard to keep me calm, but underneath it there was this edge, like he was in a rush for me to do exactly what he said. Through a partially open doorway to my left, I could see into a living room. It should have been bright with the evening sun coming in, but the curtains were shut tight, making the whole space shadowy. There were shapes of furniture inside, but the details were swallowed by the darkness. The air from that room felt even warmer and thicker, and there was a faint, stale smell I couldn't place. The voice called again, this time a little louder, almost urgent. "Please, just bring it to the kitchen." It was still polite, but the please sounded forced, like it was covering something up. My skin prickled, and something in my head told me that stepping any farther into that house would be a mistake. My fingers tightened around the strap of the bag, and I realized I was holding my breath without meaning to. He called a third time, sharper now. "It's fine. Come to the kitchen." That was when my legs started moving without me deciding it. I didn't answer. I didn't even try to think of an excuse. I just turned toward the door. I kept my steps steady so it wouldn't sound like I was running, but my chest was tight and my hands were starting to sweat. I was halfway to the front door when I heard it. Footsteps, quick ones, somewhere deeper in the house. They weren't heavy, but they moved fast, like someone was crossing from one room to another. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if those steps were coming toward me. The cool air outside hit me as soon as I stepped onto the porch. My hand was already in my pocket for my car keys before the door swung shut behind me. I walked fast down the driveway, but not so fast that I'd trip on the gravel. My ears were straining for the sound of the door opening, but it stayed shut. I unlocked my car, slid inside, and locked the doors before starting the engine. My rearview mirror stayed fixed on the driveway entrance until I was pulling away from the curb. Nothing moved behind me, but that didn't make me feel any better. Back at the restaurant, I told my manager that the customer hadn't been home and I couldn't deliver the order. I said nothing about going inside. He was irritated, muttering about wasted food and losing money, and asked why I didn't wait longer. I just shrugged and went into the back to grab water. I wasn't going to tell him I'd felt unsafe. If I was wrong, I'd sound paranoid. Later that night, I heard the shift leader trying to call the number from the order. She let it ring twice before hanging up. "Voicemail," she said to herself, and tossed the slip onto the counter. Nobody called back. 2 days later, I was on shift again when a pair of uniformed officers walked in. They spoke with the owner first, then asked if I was the driver who'd gone to 47 Oak Street that Thursday night. I nodded, and one of them asked me to step outside. They told me the owner of that house had been out of the country for 2 weeks. He and his family were vacationing in Europe. The order had been placed using a stolen credit card, and they suspected the mansion had been broken into and used for something illegal. They didn't say exactly what, just illegal activities. They asked me to go over everything I remembered. I told them about the open gate, the stale smell inside, the dust, and the voice telling me to bring the food to the kitchen. I described the change in tone, the urgency, and how I heard footsteps before I left. The detective, a middle-aged guy with a shaved head, nodded while I talked. When I finished, he said, "You did the right thing walking out. We've had a few cases where delivery drivers were lured inside and robbed, or worse." That was smart thinking. I asked if they'd caught whoever was there. He said not yet. No neighbors had seen anything, and whoever it was had cleared out before the police arrived to search the property. They'd found signs of entry through a side door and a couple of rooms upstairs that looked like someone had been staying there. But no IDs, no personal belongings, nothing left behind to track. The conversation wrapped up with the detective telling me they'd contact me if they needed more details. He thanked me again for coming forward, even though I'd technically broken company policy by leaving without delivering. The case never made the news, and I never heard from the police again. I don't know if they ever figured out who was in that house or what they were doing there, but I still think about it sometimes. How close I might have been to walking into something I couldn't walk out of. It made me realize that not every dangerous situation looks dangerous right away. Sometimes it's just a tone of voice, a strange quiet, a request that doesn't make sense. Now, whenever I get a delivery that feels off in any way, I trust that feeling. If I pull up and something in me says leave, I leave. I'll take the loss, deal with the boss being mad, whatever it costs me. Because I know now that a tip, or even my job, isn't worth finding out what's waiting in the back of a dark, locked-up house. When I first started at the mall, the night shifts were quiet. I'd pull into my driveway a little before 3 in the morning, the neighborhood silent except for the hum of a streetlight down the block. I lived on Maple Street, a narrow road lined with small single-family homes. Most nights I went straight inside, dropped my gear bag in the hallway, and crashed. About 2 weeks in, I noticed the gray pickup. It was older, mid-2000s maybe, a bit of rust along the wheel wells, the kind of dull paint you get after years without waxing. The first time, I figured it belonged to a visitor. But the next night, and the next after that, it was in the exact same spot, parked on the opposite curb, directly across from my living room windows. What made it odd was that there were plenty of open spaces up and down the street. The pickup could have parked anywhere without blocking a house, yet it always seemed to choose mine. The pattern stuck in my head. Each night it appeared only after midnight, and every morning it was gone before sunrise. By the third week, it had become a habit to glance out the window as soon as I got home. If the truck wasn't there, I felt weirdly on edge. If it was, I lingered at the blinds a little too long, trying to see if anyone was inside. But the cab was always dark. On the fourth sighting, I decided I'd had enough of wondering. I parked in my driveway as usual, left my bag inside the door, and walked straight over. The air was cold and damp, the kind that carries sound easily, so my footsteps seemed loud on the asphalt. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few quick shots of the plates. The truck was empty. Windows up, doors shut, nothing in the bed except a few bungee cords and an old tarp. But I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, like someone's eyes were on me from somewhere nearby. I scanned the yards, the porches, the dim gaps between houses. Nothing moved. I crossed back over to my place, locked the door behind me, and went to my desk where my small security monitor sat. A few months earlier, after a string of neighborhood break-ins, I'd installed a 4-camera system, 2 outside, 2 inside. Mostly it had caught raccoons and the occasional delivery guy. I queued up the living room feed from earlier that evening, around the time I was in the kitchen making dinner. The motion alert had triggered, so I hit play. The grainy black and white image showed my couch, coffee table, and part of the hallway beyond. Then, clear as day in the corner of the frame, a human silhouette moved past. Shoulders hunched, head slightly turned as if looking toward the kitchen. The figure crossed the room slowly, just inside the camera's range, then disappeared out of view. I froze, staring at the timestamp, 2 hours before I'd come home. The sound from upstairs wasn't fast or frantic. It was slow, paced, like whoever was up there had all the time in the world. Every creak in the floorboards made my chest tighten. I kept my breathing shallow, trying not to give away where I was. My eyes flicked toward the knife block on the counter, but my training came back to me. Never escalate if there's a safer option. I stepped back from the kitchen doorway, forcing my footsteps to match the quiet of the house. The back door was too close to the stairs, so I turned toward the garage instead. My hand hovered over the doorknob, listening. The footsteps stopped. The silence was heavier than the sound had been, pressing down like the whole house was waiting for something. I could feel the air change. Just that shift you notice when someone's attention is locked on you. My pulse roared in my ears. I twisted the knob and slipped into the garage, pulling the door shut behind me without letting the latch click. My shoes crunched on the concrete as I hurried toward the side door that led to my driveway. I didn't look back. Once I was outside, I jogged low across the strip of grass to my neighbor's house, knocking fast and hard until the porch light blinked on. From their living room window, I could see my own home lit up like someone was hosting a tour. The living room light blinked off, then upstairs lit up, then the hall. It was deliberate, room to room, one by one. My neighbor handed me their cordless phone, and I gave the dispatcher my address, told them there was someone inside, told them I was safe at another location. 8 minutes later, 2 patrol cars rolled up without sirens. Officers moved in with flashlights drawn, slipping through the front door. I stayed where I was, watching from the darkened window as they swept the house. 10 minutes after that, one of them stepped outside and shook his head. The intruder was gone. They found the basement window slid open, the frame marked with faint smudges where hands had gripped. The officers said it looked like it had been used more than once. Whoever it was probably knew the layout of my house by heart, including all the exits. I told them about the gray pickup and showed them the license plate photos I'd taken earlier. One of the officers jotted it down and said they'd run it through the system. That night, I didn't go back inside. I stayed with my neighbor until morning, too wired to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the upstairs light flicking on in my mind. 2 days later, a detective called. They had the owner of the truck in custody. Marcus Davis, 28, no job, a record full of minor charges. He'd been picked up in a parking lot 3 neighborhoods over. In the bed of his truck were a crowbar, a duffel bag, and a set of gloves. When they searched his phone, they found folders. One with over 50 photos of my house from different angles, another with notes. Times my car was gone, days my lights were off early, when I took the trash out. There were even notes about the clothes I wore leaving for work. He'd been inside more than once while I wasn't home, moving through like he owned the place. The detective told me, in the flat way cops do when they're trying not to make it worse, that cases like this often end badly. The pattern, stalking, surveillance, repeated entries, was the kind of behavior that sometimes shifted into assault or worse. He said catching him now was probably the only reason it hadn't gone further. I signed a statement, agreed to testify if it came to court. The charges included multiple counts of burglary, trespassing, and stalking. Davis didn't say anything to the police about why he'd targeted me. Within 2 weeks, I'd signed a lease in another part of town. Moving day, I kept looking over my shoulder as I carried boxes out. I drove past the new place twice before I pulled into the driveway, scanning the street for parked cars. Now, every night before I go inside, I take a slow look up and down the block. If a car I don't recognize sits too long, I notice. And if I ever see a gray pickup idling across from my house again, I'll be calling before I even step through the door. When I was 17, my older brother told me about these places online that you couldn't just find with Google. Shadow forums, underground marketplaces, the kind of stuff he said you needed special tools to even see. He talked about them like they were dangerous, but also like there was a whole other internet where people traded things you'd never see anywhere else. I'd just started learning basic programming, enough to make me feel like I was smarter than I really was, and the idea of finding these hidden places got stuck in my head. I thought if I could get there, I'd understand things other people didn't. He told me to be careful, that it wasn't just cool hackers using them, and that some people would mess with you for no reason. I took that as him being overprotective, like always. I didn't think I needed protecting from anyone online. I downloaded the browser he said people used for it, set it up, and started clicking through directories that led to page after page of links. The first marketplaces I found were exactly what I'd expected: digital black markets. People were selling fake IDs, counterfeit cash, hacked accounts, drugs, even stolen databases from companies I'd actually heard of. There were posts bragging about scams, tutorials on breaking into systems, and long lists of trusted vendors, like it was just another type of eBay. The feeling I got from it was like being at a party I wasn't invited to, but somehow got past the door. Everyone seemed to already know each other's names. Deals happened in private chats. But the public threads were full of coded language, weird slang, and long arguments about who could be trusted. I didn't post anything, just read. Hours would disappear that way, going from one page to the next, following links until I was somewhere completely different from where I'd started. Every time I found something new, it felt like I'd gotten deeper into some hidden world. I learned what VPNs really did, how people layered them with proxies, and why anonymity wasn't as simple as it sounded. My brother's warnings faded from my mind. I wasn't buying anything, so I figured I was safe. I told myself I was just observing, but the truth was, I liked the rush of it. After a few weeks, I found a forum that didn't look like the others. Most had sections for beginners, but this one's front page was full of bold red warnings. There was a category labeled, "For experienced users only." It was buried near the bottom, like they didn't want people stumbling into it. That just made me want to click it more. The rules were short and aggressive. No screenshots, no sharing links outside, no asking stupid questions. Breaking any of them meant you'd be removed. I'd seen enough to know that removed here didn't mean just banned. It meant your name dragged through every other forum so no one would deal with you again. I clicked anyway. The sub-forum was mostly locked threads with hundreds of replies, but one had a small icon next to it showing it was open. Inside, the posts weren't like the normal marketplace listings. They were short, and most of them had files attached instead of pictures. A few people were talking in a kind of shorthand that I could only half follow. References to tools and kits, with no real explanation. It didn't sound like physical goods. I scrolled through until I saw one that said, "Exclusive tools, tested, works as of this week." The replies under it were full of people asking for proof or offering trades. The original poster just kept saying, "Download and see for yourself." I hesitated. I knew downloading anything from a place like this was risky. Files could be packed with malware, trojans, backdoors, things that could get you hacked in minutes. But that same thought that got me into this whole mess kept coming back. If it's for experienced users only, then I had to prove I could handle it. I told myself I'd open it in a sandboxed virtual machine, just to be safe. That was enough to quiet the voice in my head telling me to walk away. I clicked the link and watched the download start. The moment I tried to open the file, my antivirus icon blinked and disappeared. A warning window flashed for a split second, then my entire screen flickered. My webcam light clicked on, off, then on again. A feed opened in the middle of the screen, not showing me, but a man in a cheap plastic mask sitting at a desk. His shoulders were hunched forward, and there was nothing in the background but a blank wall. A distorted, mechanical voice came through my speakers. He didn't ask anything. He told me he now had full control. Windows began to open and close without my touch. My personal folders appeared on the screen. School projects, family photos, scans of IDs. He opened the pictures one at a time. My mom in the kitchen, my brother blowing out candles, a blurry selfie of me. I tried to move the mouse, but the pointer slid away like someone was pushing back. He scrolled through my browser history, pausing at searches and forum links. He opened my email, selected random threads, and highlighted lines I had written. Then he launched my chat app and pulled up a conversation where I made jokes about a teacher. He brought up my saved passwords list. The names of sites I used, school portal, streaming accounts, even one linked to my parents' bank, sat in a neat column. Then he went to my downloads and opened the file I'd just grabbed, almost like proving it was bait. Finally, he activated my webcam and took a single still shot of my face. A new text file popped open, words appearing one line at a time. $500 in cryptocurrency. An address. 24 hours to pay, or he'd send everything to my school, friends, and family. To prove it, he pasted screenshots of messages and emails, cropped and stripped of context. He read subject lines out loud in that flat voice. He typed out instructions for buying crypto and warned that if I tried to stop him, he'd release everything immediately. A timer appeared in the corner, ticking down. The computer felt like it belonged to him. The cursor moved on its own, the fan roared, and the camera light glowed. My hand went behind the desk, found the Ethernet cable, and yanked it free. The video froze mid-frame. The voice cut out. I held the power button until the laptop shut down. I sat on the floor with the computer closed. I turned my phone face down and killed its Wi-Fi. I waited for some notification, an email, a text, but nothing came. I didn't sleep. In the morning, I went to the library and used a public machine to search what to do. The advice was clear. Keep it offline, back up without opening anything, wipe the drive completely, change all passwords from a clean device. I bought an external drive and took it home. I didn't tell my parents. I backed up what I could without connecting to the internet, then deleted the partitions and reinstalled everything from scratch. From my phone on mobile data, I reset every password and enabled two-factor authentication. I told my school's tech office to kill all my active sessions. I watched for signs of him in my accounts. Nothing came. For weeks, I couldn't relax. Every notification felt like an alarm. I avoided video calls. I lost school files that hadn't been backed up, but I preferred that to keeping a compromised system. He never sent anything. Maybe cutting the connection locked him out. Maybe he just moved on. But the waiting stayed with me. I erased every tool I'd installed for the dark web. I deleted the accounts I'd made and cleared the bookmarks. I stuck to regular websites. When my brother asked if I was still exploring, I told him no. The external drive sits on a shelf labeled backup. I still hesitate before plugging it in. If anyone asks, I tell them I saw a stranger take control of my life in under 3 minutes. I tell them $500 is cheap compared to the damage someone can do pretending to be you. The worst part wasn't the ransom. It was realizing how quickly a computer you trust can be turned against you. Sometimes I think about other kids trying to prove they belong in those places. I imagine their screens, full of harmless files that could ruin them if opened by the wrong person. I think about that mask, the ticking timer, and how sure I was I could handle it. I didn't handle anything. I pulled a cable and started over. Now I keep my distance. The dark web isn't a playground. It's a hunting ground. I was prey for a few hours, and that was enough. When the thought of just looking comes up, I remember the webcam light, the frozen mask, and the silence after I killed the power, and I stay away. Last summer, I was driving home after visiting my sister who lived in a small town about 2 hours away. It was around midnight, and I was taking the rural highway that cut through farmland because it was faster than the main roads. The air was cool and still, the kind of night where sound carries far, but there wasn't much to hear. Just the faint hum of the tires on the asphalt and the soft murmur of the radio. On either side of the road were open fields stretching into the dark, dotted here and there with the shadowy outlines of barns and silos. The farmhouses I passed sat far back from the road, their windows mostly dark. I'd made this trip so many times that I could picture the route even with my eyes closed, where the road bent near the old grain elevator, the dip just before the bridge over a narrow creek, the long straight stretch that seemed to go on forever. I wasn't in a hurry, but I also wasn't slowing down. The road was empty. In the last 30 minutes, I'd only seen 2 sets of headlights going the other way. My eyes scanned the lane ahead, and my mirrors out of habit more than anything else. I felt alert enough to drive, but the steady rhythm of the road had a way of making my mind drift. Every so often, I'd glanced down at the glowing clock on the dash, counting down the miles left before I could sleep in my own bed. Nothing felt unusual until I noticed something sitting up ahead, right where my headlights were about to catch it. It came into view all at once, a large cardboard box sitting directly in the center of my lane. I had to jerk the wheel slightly to the left to avoid it. The tires thudded softly over the painted shoulder line before I corrected back into the lane. My heart jumped from the suddenness of it. I kept my eyes in the rearview mirror for a moment, watching the box disappear into the dark behind me. It didn't look crushed or torn like something that had fallen accidentally from a truck. It was upright, edges crisp. I couldn't think of a reason why anyone would leave it right there in the middle of a highway. The night air through the cracked driver's window felt cooler now. I leaned forward a little, hands firm on the wheel, scanning the road with more focus. A few minutes later, something else appeared ahead. A dark shape stretching from one side of the road to the other. My headlights swept across it, revealing a pickup truck parked sideways across both lanes, lights off. The faded paint of the driver's side door reflected back a dull glint as I slowed, trying to see if anyone was inside. From where I sat, the cab looked empty. The truck didn't look damaged. No flat tires, no hood up, no sign of an accident. Just parked there like someone had stopped it on purpose. The road's narrow shoulder barely gave me room to squeeze by, but I angled the car toward it, inching past the truck with the right tires bumping over gravel. The beam of my headlights passed over the empty driver's seat as I went by. Once I was clear, I pressed a little harder on the gas, watching the mirror for movement, but the truck stayed still, shrinking into the darkness behind me. The two things, the box and now this, felt connected somehow. Too deliberate to be random. I kept both hands locked on the wheel and started checking my mirrors every few seconds, scanning for any headlights that might appear and close in from behind. The road ahead felt different now, heavier, like it was leading me deeper into something I didn't understand. About a mile farther down the highway, the steady sweep of my headlights caught movement at the edge of the road. A man stepped into view, waving both arms high over his head, signaling hard for me to stop. He was middle-aged, stocky, wearing a jacket that hung loose around him. His face looked tense, mouth moving quickly as if he'd been shouting before I even pulled close. I slowed just enough to keep my tires steady on the center line, not swerving toward him. As I neared, he stepped toward my lane, pointing back into the darkness behind him. I rolled my window down just an inch or two, keeping the engine in drive, foot ready. He said something about his car breaking down, his engine dying, how he needed a ride to the nearest gas station to make a call. His voice was strained, breath coming fast, but there was something in the way he talked, like he was rushing through a line he'd practiced. Before I could answer, his story shifted. Now he was saying he didn't need a ride, just directions because he was lost. I glanced toward the darkness where he'd pointed earlier and caught a faint metallic glint from inside the roadside brush. It looked like a bumper or a panel catching the light. Something about the earlier cardboard box, the silent truck blocking both lanes, and now this man's contradicting story clicked together in my head. My stomach tightened. "I can't help you," I said flatly through the narrow crack in the window. My hand was already on the switch to roll it back up. He took a quick step closer. I sealed the glass between us. The change in him was instant. His mouth twisted, and the tone in his voice turned sharp and violent. He slammed both palms against my window, hard enough to rattle it in the frame, yelling things I didn't want to make sense of. He jerked at the door handle, leaning his weight into it. My right foot came down on the gas, tires gripping the pavement as the car surged forward. His hands slid off the glass, his shouting fading fast in the dark behind me. I gripped the wheel tighter, forcing myself to breathe evenly, and reached for my phone. My thumb found the emergency call button, and I told the dispatcher exactly where I'd been and what I'd seen. Mile marker, direction of travel, description of the man, and the glint of a vehicle hidden in the brush. The operator's tones stayed calm, but the way she repeated my details told me she was already sending someone. The rest of the drive was a blur of mirror checks and watching for headlights that never came. Every set of approaching lights in the distance set my pulse spiking until they passed harmlessly by. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the relief didn't come all at once. It came in jagged breaths and the dull ache in my hands from how tightly I'd been holding the wheel. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind running the scene over and over, picturing what would have happened if I'd stepped out. 2 days later, a call from the police came through. An investigator asked if I could come down to speak with them in person. At the station, they laid out photos and details that twisted my stomach into knots. Officers who'd responded to my call had found a vehicle pushed back into the brush right near where I'd seen the glint. Inside was the body of another driver, someone who had likely stopped earlier that night to help. The cardboard box I'd swerved around and the abandoned pickup had been staged, bait to make drivers slow down or stop. According to the detectives, the man I'd encountered was part of a small crew that had been preying on lone motorists for months. They would set up on rural stretches, out of sight from traffic, and use the obstacles to funnel cars into stopping points where they could be approached on foot. If a driver refused or tried to get away, things often turned violent. The victim in the hidden car had apparently resisted or tried to flee and hadn't survived the attempt. They told me my call and description had helped them link the scene to other unsolved robberies in the region. The man was still at large, but they believed my refusal to step out of the car was the only reason I wasn't another case file. Driving home from the station, I kept seeing that man's face in my mirrors, the way it shifted from pleading to anger in a heartbeat. I also thought about the other driver, someone who'd probably thought they were doing the right thing. The difference between their night and mine had come down to one decision. Now, when I travel at night, I stick to the main highway, even if it adds half an hour to the trip. I keep my doors locked, my windows up, and my phone within reach. I've learned that sometimes keeping to yourself, even at the cost of seeming cold or unhelpful, is the safest choice you can make. The empty road might feel like a quiet place, but I know better now. It can hide things you don't see until they're right in front of you. And by then, you have only seconds to decide which way you make it home. When I was 23, I worked as a courier and spent a lot of time driving through industrial areas of the city. I had gotten into urban photography as a hobby and was always looking for interesting abandoned buildings to shoot for my blog. One day, while cutting through a part of town I usually only saw from the highway, I noticed a half-demolished warehouse that used to belong to a textile company. The place had been empty for years, the company gone bankrupt in the early 2000s. It sat behind a chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire, but over time, sections had been knocked down or bent out of shape by delivery trucks squeezing too close to the property line. I could see through the gaps, huge pieces of machinery still bolted to the floor, reels of something that looked like thick industrial thread, and piles of crates in the corners. The glass on most of the windows had been smashed out, and the roof had caved in over parts of the building. But it had that gritty, weathered look that would photograph perfectly. For weeks I'd been telling myself I'd go explore it. I'd drive past it on my lunch break or on my way to a job, thinking about how great those shots would look on my blog. But there was always something. Either I didn't have my camera gear with me, or I was in too much of a rush. Finally, on a Saturday morning in late spring, I packed my backpack with my DSLR, a couple of lenses, my tripod, and a water bottle, then rode my bike across town. It was early enough that the streets were quiet, just the occasional delivery van rumbling by. The sky was overcast, which made for even lighting, exactly what I wanted. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. It wasn't like I was planning to stay long. My plan was to get in, take as many shots as I could, and get out before anyone cared enough to ask questions. When I reached the warehouse, I leaned my bike against a section of fence that had collapsed inward, the metal twisted and bent enough to step through. The place was completely silent except for the wind pushing bits of trash across the cracked asphalt. I walked the perimeter first, keeping an eye out for open points of entry. Most of the front doors were either locked or blocked by debris, but on the far side, away from the road, there was a rusted service door hanging half open. The paint was peeling, and the hinges let out a long groan when I pushed it. Inside, the smell hit me right away. It was a mix of mold, dust, and the faint chemical scent of machine oil. The floor was littered with broken glass, curled strips of insulation, and stacks of yellow documents spilling from file boxes. Old wire spools lay scattered in the corners, their cables stripped out long ago. The main factory floor stretched out in front of me, massive looms and presses still in place, their metal frames coated in grime. A few of them were half covered by fallen ceiling panels. Light poured through the broken skylights above, cutting shafts through the dust in the air. I spent the next hour moving slowly through the space, switching between lenses, setting up my tripod to capture the long rows of machinery from different angles. The overcast sky kept the light even, which gave everything a muted, atmospheric tone. I could already imagine how the shots would look after a bit of editing: moody, industrial, and empty. I'd just finished framing a wide shot of the main workshop when I heard it. Metal clanging from somewhere deeper inside the building. It was faint at first, like something being knocked over or a loose sheet of siding shifting. I froze, listening. The sound came again, sharper this time, echoing down one of the dark hallways that branched off from the main floor. My first thought was that it was just the wind catching on some loose piece of metal. The place was full of it, panels barely hanging on, rusted ducts rattling when the air moved through. I didn't move toward the sound. Instead, I stayed where I was, adjusted my focus, and kept shooting. The shots were coming out too well to stop for what was probably nothing. The building felt empty, no voices, no footsteps, just the occasional creak of the structure settling. The clanging faded, replaced by the same hollow quiet I'd walked into. I told myself it was just the building breathing in the wind, and went back to my work. When I was 23, I worked as a courier and spent a lot of time driving through industrial areas of the city. I had gotten into urban photography as a hobby, and was always looking for interesting abandoned buildings to shoot for my blog. One day, while cutting through a part of town I usually only saw from the highway, I noticed a half-demolished warehouse that used to belong to a textile company. The place had been empty for years, the company gone bankrupt in the early 2000s. It sat behind a chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire, but over time, sections had been knocked down or bent out of shape by delivery trucks squeezing too close to the property line. I could see through the gaps. Huge pieces of machinery still bolted to the floor, reels of something that looked like thick industrial thread, and piles of crates in the corners. The glass on most of the windows had been smashed out, and the roof had caved in over parts of the building. But it had that gritty, weathered look that would photograph perfectly. For weeks, I'd been telling myself I'd go explore it. I'd drive past it on my lunch break or on my way to a job, thinking about how great those shots would look on my blog. But there was always something. Either I didn't have my camera gear with me, or I was in too much of a rush. Finally, on a Saturday morning in late spring, I packed my backpack with my DSLR, a couple of lenses, my tripod, and a water bottle, then rode my bike across town. It was early enough that the streets were quiet, just the occasional delivery van rumbling by. The sky was overcast, which made for even lighting, exactly what I wanted. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. It wasn't like I was planning to stay long. My plan was to get in, take as many shots as I could, and get out before anyone cared enough to ask questions. When I reached the warehouse, I leaned my bike against a section of fence that had collapsed inward, the metal twisted and bent enough to step through. The place was completely silent except for the wind pushing bits of trash across the cracked asphalt. I walked the perimeter first, keeping an eye out for open points of entry. Most of the front doors were either locked or blocked by debris, but on the far side, away from the road, there was a rusted service door hanging half open. The paint was peeling, and the hinges let out a long groan when I pushed it. Inside, the smell hit me right away. It was a mix of mold, dust, and the faint chemical scent of machine oil. The floor was littered with broken glass, curled strips of insulation, and stacks of yellow documents spilling from file boxes. Old wire spools lay scattered in the corners, their cables stripped out long ago. The main factory floor stretched out in front of me, massive looms and presses still in place, their metal frames coated in grime. A few of them were half covered by fallen ceiling panels. Light poured through the broken skylights above, cutting shafts through the dust in the air. I spent the next hour moving slowly through the space, switching between lenses, setting up my tripod to capture the long rows of machinery from different angles. The overcast sky kept the light even, which gave everything a muted, atmospheric tone. I could already imagine how the shots would look after a bit of editing. Moody, industrial, and empty. I just finished framing a wide shot of the main workshop when I heard it. Metal clanging from somewhere deeper inside the building. It was faint at first, like something being knocked over, or a loose sheet of siding shifting. I froze, listening. The sound came again, sharper this time, echoing down one of the dark hallways that branched off from the main floor. My first thought was that it was just the wind catching on some loose piece of metal. The place was full of it, panels barely hanging on, rusted ducts rattling when the air moved through. I didn't move toward the sound. Instead, I stayed where I was, adjusted my focus, and kept shooting. The shots were coming out too well to stop for what was probably nothing. The building felt empty. No voices, no footsteps, just the occasional creak of the structure settling. The clanging faded, replaced by the same hollow quiet I'd walked into. I told myself it was just the building breathing in the wind, and went back to my work. The summer of 2019, Jessica and I had just graduated college and needed jobs, so we both took positions as night desk clerks at a small roadside motel in Nevada. We were both 22 and figured it would be easy money before starting our careers. The motel sat about 15 miles from the nearest town and mostly served truckers and the occasional tourist passing through. Most nights were quiet, just a few occupied rooms, and we could study or watch movies between checking in late arrivals. The isolation didn't bother us at first. We worked together, the pay was decent, and the manager seemed friendly enough during training. The other employees were easy to get along with, and it all seemed like the perfect, low-stress summer job. The place was small, 20 rooms in a single row, the office at one end, and a separate laundry facility out back. Nothing about it felt unsafe. At night, the surrounding desert went completely silent except for the occasional hum of a semi passing on the highway. By the end of June, we had the routine down. The night shift started at 10, ended at 6, and consisted of checking in anyone who wandered in, keeping the coffee hot, and locking up the lobby at 2 in the morning. If we were both working, we'd alternate sitting at the desk and doing small chores like wiping counters or folding towels from the laundry building. We'd never had a single problem with guests. Truckers usually came in, paid, and went straight to bed. On one July night, we came in to start our shift and found only one occupied room. A truck driver had checked in around dinner time and we hadn't seen him since. The heat lingered even after sunset, and the desert air outside felt heavy. Around 2 a.m, it was time for the usual property check. One part of that was making sure the laundry building, which sat behind the main office, was locked and the machines were off. We each grabbed our phones for light. The path back there was just a gravel strip lit dimly by one buzzing pole lamp near the dumpsters. Beyond that was open desert. We'd walked it plenty of times, and it had never bothered us. The laundry room was a squat cinder block building with a single door and no windows, always dark this late. We crossed the gravel, our shoes crunching loud in the quiet. The air smelled faintly of motor oil from the garage next door, though it was closed for the night. The key stuck a little in the laundry room lock like it always did. Inside, the place was hotter than outside, the stale air smelling of detergent. The only sounds were the faint tick of cooling metal from the unused dryers. Jessica went to check the machines, while I held my phone light toward the far corner where the breaker panel was. Nothing unusual. No laundry left behind. No machines running. We moved to the door, and I locked it again. As I turned the key, I noticed the gravel near the corner of the building had been disturbed, like someone had been standing there recently. The marks weren't from us. They were deeper, uneven, with faint impressions that could have been from boots. We both looked toward the shadowy edge of the property where the pole light's glow ended. Nothing moved. The desert was silent. No wind. No insects. We started walking back toward the office, and I kept glancing behind us. The disturbed gravel wasn't enough to prove anything, but it was the first time in weeks that the routine didn't feel as safe. We reached the lobby and locked the door behind us, both of us looking toward the dark window glass a little longer than usual before sitting down at the desk. When we went back out there at 2:30, the pole lamp buzzed and the gravel still showed deep, uneven prints along the corner of the laundry building. Jessica unlocked the door, and I eased it open. Heat rolled out, stale with detergent and hot metal. A sound hit us immediately. One of the top loaders in the back was running hard, the drum thumping so steady the floor hummed through our shoes. No guests should have been washing clothes at that hour. We hadn't given out the code, and the place was always empty after midnight. Jessica lifted her phone light. On the shelf by the door sat a tablet, screen lit with the camera app, the red dot blinking. The lens was pointed straight at the entrance, propped on a folded rag. The preview showed us in the doorway, jittering a little from the vibration. Seeing our own faces on a device someone else had set up felt wrong in a way I can't explain. We didn't speak. We backed out together, watching the tablet until the door blocked it. Jessica locked the knob and deadbolt with shaking hands. I checked it twice. Outside, the noise from the machine dulled to a low throb, and the lot went back to stillness. Shadows looked deeper than they had 10 minutes earlier. We hurried to the office, kept our heads down, and slipped inside. I latched the door, slid the chain, and hit the button that locked the inner hall. Jessica dropped the blinds. We stood and listened until the rush in our ears calmed down enough to hear the AC tick. We tried our manager. 2 bars, then 1, then none. Texts spun and failed. The landline reached only room phones. Our contract binder under the desk made the decision for us. Leaving the property unattended before relief meant termination and fines. We weren't going anywhere. We pulled the old monitor around and flipped through the exterior feeds. Grainy cameras showed the laundry door, the side lot, and the rig in 12. No movement, just bugs popping as white specks. Every flicker made my shoulders jump. We kept the lobby lights on and the lot lights off to favor the glass from our side. I slid the stapler and the hole punch close without thinking. Jessica looped the master keys around her wrist like a bracelet. We spoke in short, flat sentences. If someone had set that tablet to watch the door, we had walked right into their angle. If it was for them to check later, then we had interrupted them. Either way, we decided we were not opening any door again until daylight or relief. We took turns walking the 10 steps to the bathroom and announced it out loud, like kids in a dark house. 3 o'clock dragged. A semi moaned on the highway. The AC thumped in the wall sleeve and settled. Around 4, the vibration outside stopped. No more hum through the slab. The laundry camera feed didn't change, just a pale rectangle of concrete and the closed door. We stared until the pixels swam and then forced ourselves to look away. Neither of us slept. We kept checking the windows and flinching at the ice machine knocking in its own pipes. Dawn leaked in as a gray seam and then widened. We waited for full light before we unchained the door. The lot looked plain and ordinary again. Dusty asphalt, one rig, a Coke can rolling lazy in the breeze. Our manager pulled up a little after 6. We met him at the door and told him everything. We walked him to the back. Inside, the laundry room was quiet. The top loader sat with the lid up, drum dry, a faint ring of damp on the enamel. The shelf was bare except for a lint brush and stacked rags. No tablet, no red dot. He checked the breaker, the coin tray, the locks. Nothing disturbed. Outside, the gravel prints we'd noticed looked softened under a skin of wind-blown dust. The pole lamp clicked off, and the scene lost its night shape. Back in the office, he called the day desk to ask about missing equipment. A few minutes later, he said one of the day clerks had left her tablet in the laundry the previous morning while checking the vending machines, realized at lunch, and came in early to retrieve it. She sometimes watched shows while folding linens and kept it on that same shelf. He said he'd tell her not to leave personal items in work areas. The explanation sat there between us, simple and annoying in how simple it was. We asked about the running machine. The log showed room 12 had asked for quarters at 9. The note was in Jessica's handwriting from earlier. The driver must have started a load before bed and set the delay wrong, or a timer re-engaged. The manager kept his voice neutral. He thanked us for staying inside, said we did the right thing by locking up and monitoring the cameras, and asked us to write an incident note with times. We typed the note while the sun striped the counter through the blinds. I wrote down the thump of the drum, the red RX dot, the chain, the failed calls. Jessica wrote down the scuffed gravel and the time the vibration stopped. It looked ridiculous on paper and still felt like the riskiest 2 hours of the summer. We clocked out at 6:45. I drove the flat 2-lane with the radio off and my hands tight on the wheel. I slept 3 hours and woke up picturing that blinking dot again. Jessica texted, "Still sick to stomach." I typed back, "Same." We didn't talk about courage. We talked about coverage and distance and how long 20 highway minutes become when you're waiting for help that might not find you. By Monday, we both handed in 2-week notices. The manager asked if it was the pay or the shift. I said it was the coverage and the dead zones. Jessica said it was the distance. He nodded like he understood. He didn't try to talk us out of it. Our last shifts were quiet. We folded towels, checked IDs, made coffee we actually drank. On the final morning, we walked the property once more. The laundry building looked harmless in the pale sun, small as a shed. I opened the door just to hear the emptiness, clean tile and metal, a cart with pillowcases. We locked it, hung the keys on the hook, and left. We found jobs in town, Jessica at a clinic, me at a supply warehouse. I pass the highway sign for the motel sometimes. The name blends in with 3 others, same font, same vacancy light. It's probably fine out there most nights. It was fine almost every night for us. But that one morning with a camera aimed at a door and a machine pounding in an empty room taught us the difference between safe and lucky, and how thin that line really is. We left it. When I was 15, my parents both worked late shifts, so being alone after school was just part of my routine. That spring evening in 2015, the house was quiet, except for the faint hum from the fridge and the scratching sound of my pencil on homework. Around 5, I decided to call my dad. I dialed his number without thinking, but the second it went straight to voicemail, I figured he was busy. Without paying much attention, I left a quick message telling him my brother had gone out with friends and I'd be alone until evening. My voice was casual, like I always talked to him, and I hung up right after. I put the phone face down on the desk and bent back over my math problems. About 20 minutes later, the phone rang. Dad's work number lit up the screen. I answered right away, expecting him to remind me to lock the doors or start dinner. Instead, he sounded confused. He asked what message I was talking about. I said, "The one I left earlier." He said he hadn't gotten any message from me. For a second, I thought maybe his voicemail was just full or glitched. But as I glanced at my call history, my stomach tightened. I saw I had misdialed, not by much, just a couple of digits off, but enough that it had gone to a completely different number. I told him quickly, "Guess I called the wrong person," trying to laugh it off. He didn't think much of it, but after we hung up, I kept staring at that number in my log. A stranger now knew my name, knew my brother wasn't home, and knew I'd be alone for hours. I tried brushing it off as nothing, but the thought stuck in the back of my mind while I finished my homework. A small part of me hoped whoever it was wouldn't even bother listening to the voicemail. People deleted wrong numbers all the time, right? 15 minutes later, my phone rang again. An unknown number this time. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen before answering. A man's voice came through, slow and deliberate, each word spaced out in a way that felt unnatural. He said he'd gotten my message. Then he asked, "Are you really alone at home?" The way he asked it wasn't friendly. It wasn't even curious. There was something in the tone, low, steady, almost like he was testing my answer, that made the back of my neck prickle. My mind flashed back to the message I'd left, every detail I'd given him. I forced a quick, flat reply. "Wrong number," and hung up before he could say anything else. My pulse was thudding harder than I wanted to admit. I set the phone down and went straight to the front door, testing the deadbolt even though I'd locked it earlier. Then I checked the back door, sliding the bolt in place and pulling the curtain shut over the glass. I walked from room to room, making sure every window was latched. The house felt different now, quieter but heavier, like I was listening for something I couldn't quite name. When I got back to my desk, I kept the phone right beside me, screen lit, waiting. I didn't know if he would call again, but I couldn't stop glancing at the time and listening for any sound outside. I tried to turn my attention back to my homework, but every creak of the house made me look up. My pencil hovered uselessly over the page while my eyes kept drifting toward the nearest window. Outside, the light was fading, and the glass reflected my own nervous expression. I picked up my phone and called my mom at work. She answered in a whisper, saying she was in a meeting. I quickly told her what had happened, about the wrong number, the man's call, the strange question. But she didn't seem alarmed. She just told me to keep the doors locked and that Dad would be home in a couple hours. Then she hung up. I set the phone down and turned on the TV for background noise. I flipped through channels, barely registering what was on, just trying to make the house feel less empty. I told myself I was overreacting. People called wrong numbers all the time. The man probably thought I was someone else and got curious. But the memory of his slow, deliberate voice wouldn't leave my mind. A sudden slam outside made me flinch. It was sharp and close, like a car door shutting in the driveway. I grabbed my phone and moved to the front window, pulling the curtain just enough to see out. An unfamiliar dark sedan sat in our driveway, engine off. My chest tightened as a tall, middle-aged man stepped out and started walking toward our front door. The doorbell rang 3 times in quick, harsh bursts. I froze in place. When I didn't answer, the ringing stopped, but then came the pounding, hard, insistent fists against the door that echoed through the house. I sank to the floor, staying low so I wouldn't be seen through the glass panels. My breathing was loud in my own ears, and I pressed a hand over my mouth. The pounding stopped, but I heard the rattle of the handle as he tried it several times. The sound of metal and latch sent a jolt of fear straight through me. Then, silence. A moment later, I caught movement through the corner of my eye. He was at the side of the house now. From the kitchen, I watched him through the window as he cupped his hands around his face, trying to peer inside. His head moved slowly, scanning the room, and then he moved to another window, then another. He tested the glass on one before stepping back toward the front yard. I crawled toward the living room, peeking just enough to see him return to the front door. He tried the handle one more time, standing there for several seconds before turning and walking back to his car. The engine started, and the sedan backed out of the driveway, disappearing down the street without hesitation. I stayed on the floor for a long moment after he was gone, listening for any sound that might mean he had come back. When my hands stopped shaking enough, I called my mom first. She didn't answer right away, so I called my dad. He picked up instantly, and my words came out fast and uneven as I told him someone had been at the house trying the doors and windows. He told me to stay put, keep everything locked, and that they were both on their way. By the time they got home, the man was long gone. My mom went from calm to frantic as she checked the locks herself, while Dad was already calling the police. 2 officers arrived not long after. I told them everything I'd seen: his height, his build, his car, the way he'd gone around the house. They nodded, took notes, and asked if he'd tried to break anything or made any verbal threats. When I said no, they explained that without more concrete evidence, they couldn't do much except file a report. They promised to have patrol cars pass through the neighborhood more often for the next few days. It wasn't exactly reassuring, but it was something. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside made me sit up and listen until I was sure it wasn't a car stopping in our driveway again. Even now, I still don't know how he found our address from just my phone number. Maybe he had some kind of database, maybe he worked somewhere with access to that information, or maybe he was just determined enough to figure it out. What I do know is that it was the same voice I'd heard on the phone earlier. The same slow, deliberate way of speaking, only now without the barrier of distance. Since then, I've checked every number twice before calling, and I never give away personal details unless I'm completely sure who I'm speaking to. It only takes one careless moment, one small mistake, for someone with the wrong intentions to find you. And when they do, they might show up at your door. When I was 17, I used to walk past St. Mary's Historic Cemetery every day after baseball practice to get to the bus stop. It was the fastest route home, and I didn't mind it the way some of the other guys on the team did. The place went back to the 1800s, and while it was a little run down in spots, I thought the stonework and old mausoleums were interesting. Most days I'd glance at the names as I passed, sometimes noticing the same ones I'd seen on street signs around town. By late November, the days were already short, and practice meant I was usually walking by just as it was getting dark. The sidewalks there weren't busy at that hour. Sometimes I wouldn't see another person from the school all the way to the bus. The cemetery had a tall black iron fence around it and a wide gate with a latch that was supposed to be locked at sunset. But almost every week I'd see it standing a few inches open. It wasn't like I was trying to go in, but I noticed it enough that it stuck in my head. Sometimes there'd be a single wreath leaning against the gate, or flowers in one of the bins near the front, but most of the time, it was just quiet. The street running alongside it was lined with dim orange street lamps, the kind that made everything look older. That Tuesday, practice had run a little late because the coach kept us for extra drills, so it was already more than half dark when I started down that stretch of sidewalk toward the bus stop. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. I had my bag slung over one shoulder and my cap tucked in my jacket pocket, not really thinking about much until I heard something. It was faint at first, muffled enough that I wasn't sure I'd heard it right, but it sounded like a voice. I slowed down and listened. There it was again. Someone calling out. Short bursts between pauses, like they were trying to get someone's attention. I stopped near the gate and tilted my head toward the dark rows of headstones. The voice came again, and this time I could make out words. Help. Please. It was hard to tell exactly where it was coming from, but it was definitely inside the cemetery. I turned toward the gate and saw movement between the stones, maybe 30 or 40 yards in. A shadow shifting against the pale gray markers, just long enough to make me think someone was there. My first thought wasn't anything creepy. I figured maybe somebody had fallen, or an older person had gotten stuck trying to cut through before they locked the gate. The place wasn't in perfect shape, and I could imagine a twisted ankle on the uneven ground. The street was empty both ways. I looked back toward the school, but there was no one coming. My bus wouldn't be there for another 15 minutes. I hesitated for a second, then figured I should at least check before I just walked on. I stepped up to the gate, pushed it open, and it creaked softly as it swung wider. Gravel crunched under my sneakers as I went through. Inside, the light dropped even more. The trees lining the main path were bare, their branches crossing overhead, and the wind rattled a few dead leaves along the ground. The sound of my steps seemed loud compared to the quiet. I glanced back once at the street lamp glow outside the fence, then started toward where I'd seen the movement. The voice came again, low, strained, but still calling for help. As I moved further down the gravel path, the voice had stopped, replaced by a dull thud somewhere ahead. Then I saw it. The beam from the nearest street lamp caught a row of tilted headstones, and several of them were smashed clean through. Large marble slabs lay in pieces, and chunks of stone were scattered across the grass. Off to the left, the Wilson family mausoleum stood with its iron door hanging open, the lock pried apart, and the stone around it chipped away. I slowed, taking in the mess. These weren't accidents from age or weather. This was deliberate. The sound I'd mistaken for someone in trouble had just been people messing around, hitting and breaking things. A sharp clatter echoed from inside the mausoleum, and 3 figures in dark hoodies came into view, stepping back out into the cold air. For a split second, they froze when they saw me. One of them hissed something I couldn't make out, and then they bolted, sprinting down a narrow side path toward the back of the cemetery. I stood there, my fists tightening, the anger boiling up. These weren't just names carved in stone. They were pieces of the town's history, gone forever once they were destroyed. Without thinking much more about it, I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket and hit 911. I gave the dispatcher my location, told them about the damage, and described the 3 people I'd just seen. The operator told me to stay put until officers arrived. I kept my eyes on the path they'd taken, but in the dark, I couldn't see them anymore. The patrol car's headlights swept across the gate less than 10 minutes later. 2 officers got out, their breath showing in the cold, and I waved them over to the broken headstones. They listened as I explained what I'd seen, where the vandals had run, and what they were wearing. One officer took notes while the other moved around the site, snapping pictures of the shattered stones and the forced open mausoleum door. It was clear from the way they exchanged glances that this wasn't new to them. The older officer mentioned they'd been getting calls about this cemetery for months. Reports of kids sneaking in at night, drinking, lighting fires, and slowly getting bolder with the damage. He said they suspected it was the same group hitting other places around town, too. We walked over to the Wilson Mausoleum, the beam from his flashlight sweeping inside. Pieces of the interior stone were broken loose and scattered on the floor. The air inside was damp and cold. He shook his head, muttering something under his breath, then backed out. They both agreed my call and the timing might be the break they needed in the case. I gave them my name, number, and address, and they said someone from the department would be in touch if they needed a formal statement later. Over the next few days, I didn't think much about it, until my phone rang the following Monday afternoon. It was one of the officers, telling me they'd made arrests. 3 males, all between 18 and 21, matched the descriptions I'd given. They'd been picked up near another old churchyard on the edge of town, carrying pry bars and bottles. My description, along with shoe prints from the cemetery, had tied them to the scene. A month later, I was sitting in the back of a small courtroom, listening to the charges read out. That's when I learned this wasn't just about a few bored kids wrecking things. The 3 I'd seen were part of a bigger group that had been targeting historic buildings, cemeteries, and monuments for almost a year. There'd been break-ins at the old railway station, graffiti on the town hall's stone steps, even stolen artifacts from a war memorial. The leader, barely 20, was the son of a city council member, and it came out during testimony that his father had been quietly interfering whenever his son got into trouble, making sure charges didn't stick. This time, though, the evidence was too strong. Between my statement, the photos, and the physical evidence, there wasn't much room for denial. The judge ordered them to pay restitution for the damage, tens of thousands of dollars, and sentenced them to hundreds of hours of community service, much of it under the supervision of the town's historical society. I heard later they were made to help restore the very graves they damaged, under the watch of volunteers who made sure every stone was set right. Walking past St. Mary's in the weeks after, I saw scaffolding around some of the repaired headstones and fresh flowers at the base of the Wilson Mausoleum. The gate was kept locked now, with a heavier chain and a new latch. The sight made me feel a mix of relief and unease. Relief that I'd stopped, called, and done something before they could do more damage. Unease because of how easily it could have kept going if no one had been caught. It turned out the people tearing up pieces of the town's history weren't strangers. They were from here, raised in the same streets as the rest of us. Sometimes the ones who leave the deepest marks on a place aren't outsiders at all, but people who've been walking through it their whole lives. I still took the same route to the bus stop after practice, but I never passed the cemetery without glancing at that gate, making sure it was closed. When I was 18 and just starting freshman year, I was trying hard to impress my new roommate, Katarina, an exchange student from Germany. She'd keep talking about how tame American college life was compared to what she'd heard, so I wanted to show her we could be adventurous. My friends Ryan and Alex suggested Oakwood Cemetery, this abandoned graveyard about 20 minutes from campus that people said was haunted. We grabbed some beers and drove out on a Friday night, planning to walk around in the dark and maybe tell some ghost stories. I figured it would be a fun way to bond and finally get her to think we weren't boring. The place was definitely creepy. The headstones were old and weathered, the lettering fading into moss and cracks. Weeds and tall grass had grown up so much they hid some of the graves completely. The air was damp, smelling like wet dirt and dead leaves. Our flashlight beams caught spider webs stretched between leaning stone crosses. At first, though, everything was calm. We were just wandering, taking pictures, cracking jokes about how we should be watching for skeleton hands reaching out of the ground. Katerina seemed genuinely into it, smiling and glancing around like she was impressed we'd brought her somewhere that actually felt eerie. We'd been walking maybe 20 minutes when the atmosphere shifted. The sound was faint at first, just a rustle you could write off as wind through the trees. But it kept repeating, moving, like footsteps pacing somewhere deeper in the cemetery. Then came the voices, low, muffled talking, too far away to make out words but close enough that it wasn't our imagination. We all stopped at the same time, looking in the direction it came from. That's when I saw the first beam of light sweep between the tree trunks. Not ours, someone else's. It was narrow and bright, cutting across the darkness in short bursts, like whoever had it was scanning around. Then another beam appeared, moving separately from the first. Both were coming from the far side of the grounds, just beyond where the rows of headstones gave way to thicker woods. I felt my grip tighten on the flashlight. Ryan muttered something under his breath. We weren't alone out there. We didn't stop to debate. The voices were closer now, carrying over the grass in quick bursts, laughter with an edge. It sounded like people planning something, not having fun. Ryan leaned in and said we needed to get back to the car. We turned toward the gap in the iron fence and took the same path we'd used coming in. Loose pebbles slid under our shoes. Roots pushed up through cracked asphalt. I kept my light low and tried not to crunch the gravel. Alex kept glancing back, his beam swinging over tilted stones and rusted chain. Katerina stayed on my left. I told her we were going straight to the car and not to look back. The voices kept pace with us, clearer with each bend. We passed chipped angels and a family plot with a knee-high iron rail. Weeds hissed against our jeans. Somewhere right of us, a can clinked and rolled. We sped up without running. A second later, behind us, someone shouted. Then, "Hey, where are you going?" A flashlight beam sliced between trunks, and then another swung out wide. The light steadied on us. Ryan said, "Go," and we ran. Katerina asked what was happening. I told her to keep moving toward the car. The main lane opened in front of us. The black entrance sign in the road beyond showed as a pale strip. Behind, shoes hit gravel hard. I heard, "Don't let him get to the lot." Then one of the beams burned across our backs and threw our shadows out long. The pull-off beside the road was empty except for Ryan's Civic under a leaning oak. He had the driver door open by the time we reached it. We piled in fast, Katerina into the back behind me, Alex slamming the passenger door. Ryan turned the key. Nothing. He tried again. Still dead. No dash lights. No click. "Try again," I said. He did. Silence. Alex swore, popped his door, and yanked the hood release. He lifted to the safety latch. Footsteps broke from gravel to pavement at the gate. Voices carried, "They're at the car." The beams bobbed through the fence slats and spilled onto the shoulder. Alex propped the hood. I brought my light in close. Even I could see it was wrong. A bundle near the battery hung loose, ends frayed. A connector dangled free. A plastic clip was snapped off. Alex looked at me. He didn't have to say it, but he did. This was on purpose. He tried to press a cable home. It wouldn't hold. Ryan kept turning the key. Katerina crouched low in the back, watching the fence through the side glass. I could hear her steady breaths. Then a white beam washed across the hood and into my eyes. I looked away, spots burning. Someone laughed, calm, like we were a show. A flat voice told us we shouldn't trespass there. Another voice talked about tolls. No one tried a door handle. They just circled us with light and waited. Headlights appeared on the road. All the beams shifted. An older pickup rounded the bend, yellow halogens cutting through the trees, and eased to the shoulder behind us. The driver's door creaked. A man in a work jacket got out and looked at us first, not at the fence. His voice carried. He asked if we needed help. A woman slid out on the passenger side and stood by their truck with a phone in her hand. The man walked up, set his palm on our hood like he'd done it 1,000 times, and raised it. He angled his shoulders so his back faced the cemetery. He didn't pretend the lights weren't there. He just ignored them. One glance at the loose wiring and snapped plastic and he said, quiet, that it wasn't a breakdown. He closed the hood with care and told us to grab what we needed and come to the truck. The beams twitched. Someone at the fence said we were fine where we were. Nobody in the pickup replied. The woman told us they could take us back to campus. We moved fast. Phones, backpacks, the bag of beer we never opened. Katerina stayed close, her steps short and straight. Alex locked the Civic and put the keys in his pocket. We walked to the pickup in a line. The woman slid over and told us to buckle. The cab smelled like motor oil and old coffee. We crowded onto the bench. The man took a last look at the fence, climbed in, and shut his door. He pulled away slow, tires on grit, then humming on asphalt. In the mirror, the beams merged into a pale smear and didn't follow. Maybe the game only worked if you were stuck. We didn't talk. At campus, he idled by the security office and told us to go inside and make a report. She told us to take pictures of the engine in the morning and to write everything down while it was fresh. They watched us step into the lit lobby before they pulled away. Security took our statements in a cramped room that smelled like coffee and marker ink. The officer didn't look surprised. Oakwood had been a problem for years, he said. Local kids harassed visitors, disabled cars, and scared people for entertainment. The county patrolled when they could, but it was a big area with too many ways in and out. He called a tow and told us to get some sleep. We walked to our dorm under sodium lights. We didn't talk much at all. Katerina kept her hands in her jacket pockets and walked at a steady pace. The tow brought the Civic in the next morning. In the student center lot, Ryan lifted the hood and took photos. A campus cop stopped by, wrote the incident number on a form, and said this kind of thing happened. He said groups out there cut wires, pull fuses, flatten tires, and wait. He handed Ryan a contact for the county deputy. A shop in town repaired the connector and replaced a section of harness. It wasn't cheap. Our parents called. There wasn't much yelling. We told the facts and left out the parts that would only make it worse. Nobody said "I told you so," but we heard it anyway. We changed small things. The next Friday we stayed in. The beers from the cemetery sat in my mini fridge until midterms. I started parking under lights where cameras could see. Katerina posted one photo from that night, a blurry path and the wing of a stone angel. No caption. People asked if Oakwood was really haunted. I didn't answer. I learned the reputation wasn't about stories. The cemetery had no ghosts. It had people who decided it belonged to them after dark and that anyone else was a prop. The headstones were only a set. The real danger was a hand inside a hood pulling a wire, a quiet laugh by a fence, and the patience to wait and see what you did next. The scariest monsters were bored people with time, and they didn't need anything supernatural to make a place dangerous. Yes.